During his campaign, Donald Trump said he would instruct the Treasury Secretary to label China a currency manipulator. Here we have Bloomberg Global Economics editor Dan Moss with more on what that means for the world economy and U.S.-Chinese relations.
In 2005, China broke a formal peg with the dollar. Until that point, China would intervene massively to keep its currency, the yuan, at a rate of about 8.3 to the dollar. In 2005, they abandoned that, and it's basically strengthened for most of that time. But hasn't China's currency been weakening lately? Yes, China's currency has been weakening. That largely reflects, one, a slowing Chinese economy, and two, an outflow of funds from China. China has, in the past year or so, been encouraging businesses and individuals to spend money abroad. Those things are, by their very nature, going to weaken a currency. What happens if Trump officially names China a currency manipulator? The only thing that initially happens is that the Treasury Department is required to enter into discussions with that country, followed by more discussions, and perhaps after a long process of discussion, then a couple of things might happen. For example, the country may lose access to loans from any US government agency that helps finance development projects. China right now is not seeking any new loans, though it does have some outstanding ones. So, will Trump make a deal with China? Ever since the president-elect began tweeting about China and Taiwan and took the infamous phone call from the Taiwanese leader, people have been wondering, does he see a deal to be done with China? And if there is a deal to be done with China, what role does this question of wither manipulation play? Is he prepared to say, look, I didn't really mean that. What I really want is X, Y, and Z. Nobody knows.
With us now from Washington, D.C. to break this all down is Bloomberg intelligence analyst Caitlin Weber. And here on the set with us in New York is Bloomberg radio host and economics editor Michael McKee. Michael, let me start with you since you're sitting here. The piece we just showed ended with a question, which goes to a deeper issue. Trump railed against China throughout the campaign. China, he called it over and over again. What's your assessment of the depth of the sincerity of his antipathy towards China?
I can ask you guys that about everything that he has said. Nobody really knows. It's a great talking point on the campaign trail, of course, because it gives you a villain, the Chinese stealing all our jobs. But given what the Chinese are doing, the fact that they're propping up the currency, which in theory is what he wants, it's hard to know actually where he's going with this.
Caitlin, what is the state of relations between the U.S. and China right now? What are the people focused on the negative aspects, but what are the parts where it seems like the relationship is something positive that could be built on?
Well, the U.S. and China are highly integrated economies. The U.S. consumers rely on China for 90% of our smartphones, for example, for a large percentage of our laptops. And so, where there are definitely tensions over currency and over other trade practices, U.S. companies, including Apple and others, have really highly integrated supply chains with China.
Michael, let me ask you this. If Trump, go back to my question line before, if Trump decides to label China a currency manipulator, what happens?
Not a lot. As your piece earlier with Dan Moss pointed out, the law calls for China to be brought into they give them a year to come into negotiations with the U.S. and exactly what they're supposed to negotiate is left open, probably some sort of change in their exchange rate. If they don't, then after another year goes by, they can deny them financing from the Overseas Private Investment Corporation for funding for projects there. The trouble is with China, we've already cut off their access to that from Tiananmen Square, so that's not even an issue. So there really isn't anything they can do. Also, manipulation under the U.S. law, China doesn't meet the test. So you can't name them a currency manipulator based on the criteria Congress has set out. So he can only do it by basically an executive order calling them names.
Right. Caitlin, if China stopped loaning money to the United States, investing in the United States, we'd be in big trouble. I've been hearing for years that that's a threat. Is there any threat if Donald Trump did something along these lines on trade, currency, that really made China angry and they said, we're going to retaliate? Could they start withdrawing money from the United States in a way that would devastate our economy?
I mean, absolutely. The U.S. is reliant on, China. It's our biggest creditor. Well, actually, Japan has very recently overtaken it as its biggest creditor. But I mean, I think, the stakes couldn't be. You really can't overestimate the stakes with a trade war with China.
But what would the effect be if China did that? Would there be a lot of downside for them, and therefore they might be reluctant to do it?
I mean, absolutely, because China, of course, relies on us for, a lot of, we buy so many of their products, and U.S. companies invest so much in their economy. I mean, that's why, both parties, I think, once they get down to the negotiating table, will be really reluctant to, really have those negotiations break down and see a full-scale trade war.
Trump talked tough on China. As you said, we don't really know how much he means it, how much he'll fight for it. How much sentiment is there in Congress amongst Republicans and Democrats to be tough on China, where there'd be an anti-China coalition that Trump could rally if he wanted to do something with Congress?
You have a divide. You have the trade state Congress people who blame China. You remember back in the 90s when we had people bashing Toyotas in on Capitol Hill, Marcy Kaptur and her sledgehammer. You have that constituency, but then you have a lot of free trade Republicans who wouldn't like this because the Chinese are likely to, as she said, retaliate somehow, put some sanctions on that would hurt companies. They could certainly hurt the electronics industry. They could hurt Boeing. Boeing sells about 5% of its jets to the Chinese. Agriculture. Hello, Iowa. They could put sanctions on U.S. agricultural imports. So there's a lot the Chinese could do. They probably won't sell U.S. Treasury bonds because if you do a fire sale of Treasury bonds, the price goes down, they lose money. But we do need them to keep buying, especially if Trump, in his other economic policies, is going to run up the deficit again. Right.